BELF and standards. Before I forget, you can have access after the session to all the slides. There's more information on the slides than we can actually say, and we don't want to read everything off the slides. So although you're welcome to take notes, of course, you will get the slides so you can find the links and the references. Okay, yeah, we're both based in Germany, so it's actually our lunchtime at the moment. We're doing without lunch today to talk to you, which we're very pleased about. And this is our agenda. We're hoping to get through it in half an hour. And then, of course, we're going to take your questions. We're going to talk about native speakers and non-native speakers, so-called. Is BELF or ELF a language without standards? And then the main part, which is why it's in red, from standard language to ELF-informed pedagogy. And want to refer to the challenges and also find out how you see the challenges involved in teaching what you call, or what we call, English as a lingua franca in whatever context, including business. Okay, Rudi's in charge of the slides, and he's taking over now.
Yes, and we'll start with a ELF or BELF variety that has been operative for some time. That's aviation English, highly formalized, being taught, being tested, and still there's a lot of empirical evidence that about 70% of near-miss events and accidents are caused by misunderstandings occurring between pilots and air traffic controllers. And that, of course, has raised lots of discussions about this variety of ELF or BELF, however you would like to call it. And there's one...
363, start up and push at 05. Tower,
so that was just an audio clip from it. There's a doctoral PhD thesis by Hye-Young Kim from the University of Melbourne, who actually interviewed people involved in the commercial air traffic in Seoul. And the finding he brought forward was quite interesting, because he said, actually, native speakers and non-native speakers among pilots and air traffic controllers share responsibility equally in terms of creating confusion. That raised a global discussion about what actually aviation English is about and what role native speakers play in this field. The findings of this PhD thesis are confirmed by this study commissioned by the European Commission, and they actually specify the reasons for misunderstandings along the lines of cultural differences, language structure, ambiguity through word choices, and distortions of meaning, in particular if standard phraseology is not used, usually by native speakers of English, etc., etc. So the question that follows from this is actually, and that's over to you, Judith.
Yeah, thank you. The interesting point is, which is that native speakers, so-called native speakers, do not have to take the test that people working in the airline or air traffic industry do have to take, because it's assumed that they will be able to communicate appropriately in English, which is not always the case. But that raises the question, of course, who exactly are native speakers, and what do we mean when we think about native speakers? This is a rhetorical question. It's probably not so much for you, but more for the people that you have to deal with when you're trying to propagate the notion of ELF or BELF. And the monolithic constructive language is one which is shared by most learners, teachers, and decision makers, which starts with the language as something existing on its own at the top of the pyramid or at the top of the tree. Then there's good language, ordinary language, and right at the bottom, dialects, sociolects, and so-called errors. We'll be coming on to errors and mistakes in a minute. This model, actually, it's taken from, but the link seems to be, the reference seems to be missing, Rudi. It's covered up by a black box. From a project that was conducted by the British Council with St. John's York University, Changing Englishes, which I was involved in the first round of, to introduce teachers to the whole concept of Englishes and English as a lingua franca, and not just a language owned by native speakers. And the point we want to make here, and this relates to something we were talking about a bit earlier, testing boards, is that standard language is a political construct. There's hardly anybody who uses the language, standard language. It's a political thing in any country and any language. The idea of standard language, none of us here probably speak a language in its standard version under any circumstances. And the sociolinguistic construct of language is bottom up rather than top down, which starts with all the millions and billions of idiolects, the languages that we actually use, the language we actually use, moving on to dialects where we communicate with other people speaking in the same way, and so on and so forth, until we get to the language. And this sociolinguistic construct is generally challenged by decision makers. We're asking this as a question. This is also one of the challenges that I encountered when I was head of a language department: curriculum designers, coursebook designers, test developers, teachers in many cases, and of course learners. So these are all the notions of language that we will have to deal with when we're trying to get across the idea, the notion of ELF or BELF. And the question, of course, is how can any language at all be taught if it's not related to a standard variety? This is the $64 million question that we're going to attempt to answer, or to lead you in the direction of the answers, I have to say, during the next 20 minutes or so. And that's why we put in a few images of books, which all teach basically standard language. So back to Rudi.
The question is actually specified, for example, by Camerer, when he says ELF is intersubjectively constructed in each specific context of interaction. And then, of course, we need to ask, how can you prepare learners for an unspecific number of specific contexts of interaction? And perhaps one answer that can be very helpful is given, and has been given on various occasions, by Silvana Richardson. Those of you who regularly attend IATEFL conferences will be familiar with her. Back in 2016 in Birmingham, she had quite an impressive plenary speech on native speakerism, etc. But when it comes to teacher development, she has something very special to say. And here's something that she addressed only recently.
I was born and spent the most formative years of my life in South America, where we have absolutely no idea what's going to happen tomorrow, let alone in 5 years. So I know it's not in my national DNA. I'm not even going to go there. So that's my excuse. Don't worry. I don't care if you don't vote for me. I'm going to talk about what I would like professional development in ELT to do in the next 5 years. I would like continuous professional development initiatives to equip and to enable teachers to develop more context. I was born and spent the most formative years of my life in South America, where we have absolutely no idea what's going to happen tomorrow, let alone in 5 years. So I know it's not in my national DNA. I'm not even going to go there. So that's my excuse. Don't worry. I don't care if you don't vote for me. I'm going to talk about what I would like professional development in ELT to do in the next 5 years. I would like continuous professional development initiatives to equip and to enable teachers to develop more contextually appropriate methodologies. For too long, teacher development has focused on same old, and then technology. Same old has been basically a rather limited and narrow repertoire of techniques, strategies, which, like flat pack furniture from IKEA, we can transport wherever we want to go, we can unpack, and we can use with very, very little reference or attention to the linguistic, cultural, social, educational background of the people that we teach. These methodologies, of course, have been designed for the globally mobile native speaker, and therefore a lot of the time have very little relevance to the needs of the people anywhere else in the world. So what we really, really need is teachers and teacher educators who understand, they already do, but who are able to research their own contexts more deeply, so that rather than just being consumers of knowledge, they become creators of locally appropriate and culturally appropriate and educationally appropriate knowledge. We need teachers and teacher educators who are able to tap into the single most valuable resource, the student's own language. We need teachers and teacher educators who are able to create bilingual and plurilingual learners who are the kind of thing that this globalized world needs. And all this needs a critical mindset. So we do need teachers and teacher educators who are also able to genuinely encourage teachers to think creatively, to challenge, and to think critically. That's my non-prediction. Thank you very much.
Well, this is practically the outline of what we're going to present to you in the following minutes. Now over to you, Judith. Judith, are you with us?
I'm here. Yeah, that's right. So what we're going to ask you to do is to try and bear in mind what she says, because although she doesn't specifically refer to ELF or BELF, all the things she says are very, very relevant to the topic. And we're going to try and introduce you to our 7 steps to defining a BELF standard in terms of ELF-informed pedagogy. It's all about context. Even business English has a very large number of specific or unspecified context. And of course, as we all know, there's a big overlap with ESP, so-called ESP. Basically, it's all connected to facing up to reality, to the reality that we live in today. And that's what Silvana has been saying. So ELF-informed pedagogy, the first step is to identify the level and the type of English already learned. This is fairly banal. It's a needs analysis step that you'll all be familiar with if you're in teaching. But the type of English that the learners have already learned can be very important in considering how they regard the language, so-called Queen's English, no longer available, so-called BBC English, so-called Shakespeare English. Then the next step, slightly more difficult, is to establish learners' preconceptions and your own. How do they regard mistakes? That's one big thing we're going to talk about, so-called mistakes. And this is one thing from the Common European Framework, from the companion volume. And it's a definition of mistakes, which I think can be expanded slightly. It's at the bottom part under B2. The scale is conversation, can sustain relationships with users of the target language without unintentionally amusing or irritating them, or require them to behave other than they would with another proficient language user. And this was something I found extremely useful with students, with university students, to get them to think about what are important mistakes. And my definition was a mistake is serious or potentially serious if it causes confusion or misunderstanding, especially misunderstanding which is not noticed by the participants. If it unintentionally amuses, that is, you don't want to be funny, but people laugh, and if it insults or offends. And this refers to mistakes of any type, whether they're grammar mistakes, which are the ones that most teachers tend to focus on, vocabulary mistakes, or pragmatic mistakes, mistakes of pragmatics, so-called. I'm just using the word mistakes because this is the one that's most commonly used, mistakes or errors. So this is a definition which I feel can be discussed and can help to raise awareness, which we'll be coming to in a minute, among learners and among others in the field. So to raise or establish awareness of the diversity of Englishes. This is another step that we think is extremely important. There is no one English, not even the English that I speak is a standard variety. And I think I've now run into your bit, Rudi.
Which is okay, of course. Homogeneous learner groups are the exception nowadays, as you probably know, both in corporate context and in academic context. You almost always have international groups of learners, which as a start is extremely helpful in raising awareness to the diversity of Englishes. And then there's, of course, a lot of material available to sensitize people on the plural character of the English language, that is Englishes. That's not our invention, but has been around for over 20 years now. There's one book we very much recommend and which we found extremely helpful. This is this one here, which of course includes exercises for raising awareness. For example, a questionnaire to be answered by students with yes and no. For example, number one, most people who use English around the world are non-native speakers, true or false. Or number two, there are only 7 countries where English is an official language, true or false, etc., etc. So we highly recommend this book for getting ready for ELF and BELF teaching.
So next step, encourage risk-taking and creativity. Many years ago at an IATEFL BSIG conference, Mark Powell, who was one of the keynote speakers, said, I don't know if this is true, but I have told students this, that most innovations in the English language come from so-called non-native speakers. So they can invent language or words or whatever they want, and they may go down in history, they may appear in a dictionary. Students actually really liked this. That's the creativity part, and also the idea of my English. We each have our own variety of English, so there are all sorts of things that may be completely acceptable in many contexts, but which I don't use for whatever reason. And encouraging students to form their idea of my English is another one that we think is important. This is something that Kurt Cohn said. I wasn't at the session, but I did watch the recording. And creativity. Creativity is very important as a compensation strategy, but it's also important in dealing with how other people understand you. The example that sprang to mind was a student saying workless as opposed to jobless or unemployed. And another student asked, isn't it unemployed? And I said, well, yeah, in a way it is unemployed, but workless is also a possibility. It's quite clear what you mean and why not. So this is another thing that needs to be encouraged. Often in school teaching, teachers are less interested in what learners say than in how they say it. That is, that they use correct grammar and vocabulary rather than the message they're trying to convey. So moving away from that and encouraging your students not to worry so much about how they say something, but what they want to say is another step.
Risk-taking and creativity connect with plurilingual and pluricultural competences, and practically all learners have exactly this, plurilingual and pluricultural competence. And this is just one example on the receptive end. Even if you don't understand Romanian, you will understand what this sign actually is trying to say. So encourage learners to take risks and use all the repertoires they have. The next one would be relationship building, with a focus on first, second, third encounters. That we feel is extremely important, and it connects with communication theory, which has been largely disregarded by linguistics for the last 30 years, because the approach in this field, the social constructivist approach, started in the 1960s actually, and one of the 5 axioms provided by Butler, Beavan, Jackson, and supported by all academic fields I have any knowledge of, is that each communication has a content aspect and a relationship aspect. And the most important thing is that unless we succeed on the relationship side, the content side will probably fail. So the first focus needs to be on identity roles and relationship building. Which brings us to the question of politeness, because politeness in its most general definition is a process of relationship building at the beginning of a relationship. And part of it is that it does take time to establish something like a trusting relationship. And the most important thing is politeness does not start with B1 or anywhere in the scale that's been used so far. And secondly, politeness conventions are not universal. So we'll have to take them very seriously when we try to prepare learners for an international world where different ways of relationship building are considered normal. Now, Judith.
Yep. And then, and this is the most difficult one, provide them with a language repertoire. And we have said little by little, this is an acceptable language repertoire for the context that they intend to work in. We're talking about business English, so for their context, who they're going to be speaking to, where those people have learned English and what sort of English they've learned, the level of English, and so on. This is a recommendation from a publication from the ECML, the Council of Europe, that the approach to be adopted isn't all or nothing, but little by little. And this was something that we discussed with participants in a training session that we offered, that we ran recently. And there was a slightly controversial discussion about coming up front, being upfront about teaching English as a lingua franca. Why shouldn't you just say, this is what I'm going to teach you? The little by little can be understood in two ways. One is that it's English as a lingua franca is introduced surreptitiously into an already existing curriculum, which is what it more or less says here. But on the other hand, I can see the reasoning behind being upfront about it and saying this is what we want to teach, because this is reality today. And so we're going to do it. But that will, of course, lead to a large number of challenges, I assume. I didn't do this myself, but in the end, I realized it was what I was teaching without actually saying I'm teaching English as a lingua franca. So that's something to think about and maybe discuss later. How far you want to actually go all out on ELF or BELF. And then, of course, the language repertoire will include teaching the basics, things that we do need to consider: vocabulary and grammar, pronunciation and comprehensibility. We'll be coming back to these in a minute. Listening and understanding, speaking so that others understand you, speaking clearly according to the context. It's all related to the context. And for us, most importantly, pragmatics, which is politeness, relationship building, and trust. And when I said earlier about how often teachers are more interested in how something is said, it usually only relates to the how of vocabulary, pronunciation, grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation, and grammar, rather than the how in terms of politeness or relationship building or trust. And that's the how that we think we should be focusing far more on than we have done up to now. I'd also include myself. I've taught for a very, very long time, and also all levels, and I too was guilty of this. So how do you teach vocabulary and grammar? Again, it's a rhetorical question, which we don't really know how to answer, except possibly considering what not to teach. There are various things that it's not necessary to teach. All the individual items of vocabulary for a certain field may not be necessary. They're often taught, sort of all the names of animals, let's say, may not be necessary because the learner is only going to deal with one or two animals. That's just an example. And here I found this, and this is just my idea really about possibly what not to teach extensively, taken from a B1 course book, a recent one, a very recent one, where all of these were included, rather in a sort of gallop through all of English grammar in one level. Reported speech, the past perfect continuous or the future perfect continuous, which I myself have a bit of difficulty thinking about when do we use this. Gerund against infinitive, adverbs and adjectives. After hearing Antony Blinken, the American Secretary of State, saying we must take this serious, I actually wondered whether there was any point in teaching adverbs at all. And a few other things that are often taught at relatively low levels, extensively, practiced and taught extensively. And I would ask whether this is really important. It's a question which everybody can answer for themselves. Okay, so back to Rudi, pronunciation.
We're not asking the same question when it comes to pronunciation, because that is essential, because it connects with comprehensibility. And this is one of the books we highly recommend, Robin Walker's book. And it is particularly recommendable for the reason that he actually provides information what specific difficulties other L1 learners have with pronunciation in English. And he was the first to provide this kind of information, and we still find it extremely helpful. We're not so sure whether the empirical research provided by ELF Research, for example, here Jennifer Jenkins, in terms of the lingua franca core, is actually helpful in practical teaching situations. It's an interesting empirical research and contains interesting statistics, but it doesn't really provide me with additional help in preparing a teaching situation, I'm afraid. What I might focus on is the suggestion on the part of the CFR. They suggest looking at articulation, prosody, accentedness, and intelligibility. And there's one thing I would like to draw your attention to, because here is a norm mentioned, but of course, what they mean actually is context-specific norms, and context-specific norms in terms of pronunciation are very different, let's say, for Nigerian native speakers of English as compared to, let's say, Hong Kong native speakers of English, etc. So what we suggest in this context are these books, which you are familiar with. Judith, if you want to say a few words about these.
One thing about the last slide, if you just go back a second, because the description of phonological control in the Common European Framework refers to any users of the language, also to so-called native speakers or highly proficient speakers. They're all things that we all need to think about when we use a language, any language, our own language or another language that we've learned, and in this case, English. I, like most teachers, or many teachers, let's say, maybe it's not the same, I'm a bit frightened of pronunciation things and activities, and I've never really, done a lot with it. But these were some publications that encouraged me to try do more pronunciation work in my classes. The middle one, Ship or Sheep, is very, very, very old. I think it was around when I first started teaching, so it must be really old. Evan may also remember it. But these are activities, and also the book that we mentioned earlier, Teaching English as a Lingua Franca, also has pronunciation activities and suggestions for them. This is also an approach. This whole approach, English as a Lingua Franca, is one that's been very much taken up by IATEFL. And if you could move on, Rudi. IATEFL, if you don't know it, is the International Association of Teachers of English as a Foreign Language. I'm a trustee. Evan is an ambassador for IATEFL and one of the plenary speakers at the next conference. IATEFL has 16 special interest groups, and the pronunciation special interest group is very focused on pronunciation in English as a lingua franca. English is an international language, English used between many different speakers. And this upcoming event, the pre-conference event, I think is very interesting because it does refer to a fear that many teachers have about teaching pronunciation. So feel the fear and teach it anyway. I like it. Listening is the next thing we're going to think about.
That is very important too, because again, it connects with the aspect of comprehensibility, and we would recommend very much Ian Badger's books, which you'll find an example here, and listening to one example, provided technology allows it. We ask the question written here, how much do we judge people by the way they speak?
Japanese people think insist their opinion is a very rude attitude for as a colleague. For example, the boss orders some works for Western country people, but they don't want to do that. They suggest another solution or another way to work that things, but it is very rude for Japanese because for Japanese culture has a Confucianism, and so we should obey the elder people, mainly the
question, how much do we judge people by the way they speak, I can address to myself, because I find being biased on account of how people speak either my native language, German, or English. And I can tell you several examples of where I was absolutely wrong in judging people, and that would be part of raising awareness of different varieties of English.
So then we come to speaking. Speaking, of course, consists of also what you do with any material, choosing, adapting, and creating activities, which probably most of us will have to do. We may create our own activities for the use of English as a lingua franca. We may have to use activities that we're provided with in course books or material that we're provided with. And here, the main thing is, of course, the context. The aim of the activity, the level of the students, and the context, but the context being the most important thing. And for me, and this is connected with having worked in testing for a long time, the criteria for assessing success. And this doesn't mean only in tests, it's actually connected to any classroom activity. What are you actually focusing on? And although correctness is in the first place here, this is something that a lot of teachers do still focus on. This may not be the most important thing. There obviously are activities where correctness is what you're aiming for, but in general, you could focus just on politeness and leave out correctness of grammar, vocabulary. You could focus on participation, talk as much as you can, or interaction, involve other people, and focus on those separately so that learners possibly, I would hope, lose some of their inhibitions. This is something that I've also done. And I find that it helps a lot because they forget about the correctness part of it and focus on being polite or on their pronunciation or on understanding what others say, focusing more on that. You may also want to focus on the main aim of the activity, how they manage to achieve the task, fulfill the task, or whether they do fulfill the task. And pointing out these things out to them and not trying to focus on them all at once in a non-testing situation can be extremely helpful in raising awareness and doing away with fears that students, learners have of speaking. Main fear is of speaking generally. This is something taken from Barbara Seidelhofer, what ELF users regularly do. These are all things that are considered mistakes by many English teachers. The most popular mistake I've found when I've done training sessions on mistakes is, or popular pet hate mistake, is the third person singular S. But as we all know, however much you tell learners that there's an S on the third person singular, it doesn't help them to use it. They can learn to use it if they want to, and they can practice, and eventually they'll get it. That don't really matter, but they are often the ones that are identified by teachers. And there are activities in course books which I, again, feel are not particularly useful. Asking for and giving detailed directions to somewhere, learning and practicing idioms. There may be a case for understanding idioms, but I'm not even sure about that. Practicing speaking quickly, more and more quickly, quicker and quicker. Trying to speak like a British native speaker and swallowing half the syllables may be absolutely non-helpful in many situations. And also possibly learning long lists of phrases, although I think we all probably know that giving learners long lists of phrases doesn't actually help them to use them. And there are probably many more. These would be the things that I personally would try and avoid, leave out of a course if it were possible, depending on obviously how much control I have of what I'm teaching. So, and then we come to writing.
On the change of paradigm signaled by ChatGPT and others has been foreshadowed by Google Translate and DeepL, etc. The situation is completely different now and will affect everyone's teaching of, for example, business correspondence. I cannot really imagine any company in international business doing their business correspondence by hand from now on. And we actually check this using a highly, demanding task, which we have used in our training courses for a long time, the distinction between Western styles of business correspondence and Eastern styles. And this is just a brief outline of where the differences lie. And using this example from a worksheet we use, which is written in an Chinese discourse strategy, including a lot of face saving, a lot of politeness strategies before the point is really made what the email is about. We asked ChatGPT to, respond adequately to it, and the response was absolutely okay. So even demanding skills are managed well with ChatGPT. So the future of business correspondence will have to take that into account. And finally, we come to pragmatics. How do we teach pragmatics? How does it affect our teaching? And perhaps a brief list of things that count. And that's over to you, Judith, again.
Yeah, these are some of the language functions that we feel count. When we first started thinking about these, we thought actually that saying no was more difficult than saying yes, but in fact it's not. They're all more or less the same in relation to difficulty doing it in the right way, which does not mean not making any grammar mistakes. And these are some of the ones that we have identified and focus on in our courses. There are, of course, many more. And similarly, there are discourse strategies. These, I think, are actually more important and more interesting. This is taken from Andy Molinsky's book. And you recognize these and be able to relate them to people. You know, they're often related to national cultures, but not only. Directness, and we live in Germany. I'm not German, but Rudi is, and Germans are famous for being very direct. Not all Germans are extremely direct, but it is a feature of Germanness. And to go to the last one, personal disclosure. How much information do you give about yourself when you first meet somebody? Do you tell them about your marital status, how many times you've been married, how many children and grandchildren you have, or do you wait until the relationship has developed? And these things vary from culture to culture, using culture in its broadest sense. So the question again is, can you teach different ways of dealing with these? Also, in such a way that the learner doesn't have to, let's say, sell his or her soul and do something that is completely alien, completely strange. We've tried as far as we can to suggest middle ways so that I don't do anything which really I don't really want to do, behave in a way that I don't want to behave in. So that's basically what we have to say. And we didn't provide you with the answers, at least not all the answers. But we hope that we've helped a little bit to helped you a little bit to think about what your own answers in your specific context might be. We hope that the back and forth between the two of us hasn't been disturbing. This is how we like to do it. And of course, we'd like to come on really to the challenges that you'll be faced with.